Have you ever noticed that two people can experience the exact same event and walk away believing two completely different things about themselves? One person loses a job and thinks that this wasn't the right fit, another thinks I'm a failure. The event is the same, story is different.
Before we begin, welcome to Unapologetically Reborn. This isn't a podcast about quick fixes, positive thinking, or pretending the past didn't happen. These conversations are designed to challenge the way you understand yourself, your relationships, your nervous system, and the survival strategies that shaped your life. The goal of this podcast is to translate trauma into language that makes sense, so you can better understand your experiences, recognize your patterns, and explore yourself with greater clarity and compassion. This podcast is intended for educational and personal growth purposes. It is not a substitute for therapy, mental health treatment, medical care, or crisis support. If you find yourself becoming emotionally overwhelmed, please consider pausing the episode, practicing self-care, and reaching out to a qualified mental health professional for additional support. Healing isn't about becoming someone new. It's about understanding who survival required you to become, and discovering who you are underneath the armor. If you're ready to have honest conversations, ask difficult questions, and explore what it truly means to heal, welcome to Unapologetically Reborn. This is where survival ends, and choices begin.
Welcome to Unapologetically Reborn. Today we are in The War Within series, and the topic is the war inside your mind. This is probably going to go over time since it's a special series, as well as the workbook is a lot more in depth. So I would suggest please go and get the workbook at www.unapologeticallyreborn.com. I'm going to touch on this as much as I can, but there's so much information in this topic. We may not be able to get through it all in this podcast. So every trauma survivor experiences the war inside their mind, but very few people understand. So basically, I guess what I'm trying to say is, have you ever wondered why that you can't stop overthinking? Why your brain assumes the worst? How you can play conversations from 5 years ago or convince yourself someone's upset with you, even if there's no evidence to support that? Well, you're not alone. So why does trauma change the way that we think? More importantly, how does healing change it back? So let's look at a story. What exactly is a story? So if we dissect this, a story isn't simply a memory. It's basically the meaning that we attach to what happened. So for an example, let's use some possible child scenarios. A child whose parents divorced, one child might tell themselves, "It wasn't my fault." Another child may decide that if they'd behaved better, maybe mom or dad wouldn't have left. Maybe they would have stayed. Children often create stories because they need an explanation for experiences that they don't fully understand. These stories become beliefs because children don't usually think, "I experienced trauma." They think something must be wrong with me. I must not matter. I have to be perfect. Maybe I had to stay quiet, or love wasn't safe. These conclusions become beliefs, and these beliefs shape our identity. Survivors often tell themselves things like, "I'm not enough," no matter what they accomplish. They still feel like they have to prove themselves. Or maybe the other side, "I'm too much, too emotional, too needy, too sensitive, too loud, too broken." So they begin shrinking themselves or keep themselves in certain places to maintain various relationships. Things like love has to be earned. Maybe I'll finally deserve love if I work harder. Maybe if I lose weight, or I never upset anyone around me. Maybe if I take care of everyone else, keep them happy. Another one, people always leave. So people that believe that scenario, it's like every goodbye reinforces this belief. Even if healthy distance feels like abandonment. So another one, my needs don't matter. They become experts at meeting everyone else's needs while ignoring their own. I have to be perfect. Mistakes become terrifying and perfection becomes protection. Maybe I'm responsible for everyone. If someone's upset, they assume it's their job to fix it. So where do these stories come from? Do you know?
No.
My question to you would be, who taught you this? Who benefited from you believing it? Is this your voice or is this someone else's? Why do we protect these stories? Well, the answer is they helped us to survive. So if I believed that I had to keep everyone happy, maybe conflict decreased. If I believed that I didn't matter, maybe disappointment hurt less. So the story isn't random, it's protective. But what happens when the story no longer serves you? So now the story begins causing pain. The very thing that once protected you begins limiting you. And this is what we're discussing. That's extremely important in your healing. Rewriting the story, not pretending that the past didn't happen, not forcing positive thinking, but instead writing a more truthful story.
Old story, I'm unlovable. New story, I learned to feel unlovable because the experience that were never my fault. Old story, I ruin everything. New story, I made mistakes like every human being, but But mistakes don't define my worth.
All right, so let's do a little mini exercise. So let's pretend that your life is a book. Who's writing it? Is it fear? Is it trauma? Is it shame? Is it other people's opinions? So in the end, who do you want writing the next chapter?
What if I believe these stories for 50 years?
Then you'd have 50 years of repetition, but it doesn't mean that they're true. It means they're familiar. Healing isn't about pretending that these stories never existed. It's about deciding that they don't get to write the final chapter. So repeated experiences create neural pathways. The more you hear something, the easier it is to, for the brain to believe it. But the brain can build new pathways. And this is why healing takes repetition. So if your inner critic had to prove every accusation in court, would there actually be enough evidence to convict you of your crime? Why does my brain do this?
Okay, let's start with probably the biggest question. Why won't my brain stop thinking?
Brains are prediction machines. Their job isn't to make us happy. Their job is to keep us alive. So when you've lived through things like trauma, your brain learns that danger can happen unexpectedly. So instead of relaxing, it constantly scans for problems. It's always asking, what did I miss? What if something bad happens? What should I have done differently? The brain believes that thinking equals protecting.
So overthinking isn't because we're broken?
No. It's because your brain becomes really good at survival. The problem is survival mode doesn't know when the emergency is over.
Expecting disaster.
Yeah, exactly.
That leads into another question. Why do I always expect the worst?
Because disappointment hurts less when you think you saw it coming. So trauma teaches us that good things don't last. So instead of hoping, we prepare, and our brain thinks it's protecting us. But expecting disaster steals today's peace for tomorrow's possibility.
So, catastrophizing is really the brain trying to control the uncertainty.
Exactly.
Here's one I think almost everyone does. Why do I replay conversations?
Uh, well, trauma teaches us that relationships determine safety. So after conversations, our brain asks, did I say something wrong? Did they misunderstand me? Do they still like me? Should I have said something different? So we replay these conversations because we're looking for danger that may not even exist.
Okay, why can't I make simple decisions?
When you've been criticized or controlled, punished, or made to believe that mistakes weren't safe, every decision starts feeling enormous. So choosing dinner can feel like choosing your future because your brain isn't evaluating the decision, it's evaluating the possible consequences.
This one surprised me when we talked about it. Why do compliments make me uncomfortable?
Because compliments don't match the story that trauma taught us. So if you believed you're not enough for years, someone saying that you're amazing creates conflict inside your brain. The compliment isn't uncomfortable, the contradiction is.
Okay, how do I know if it's intuition or fear?
Fear is loud, it's urgent, you're panicked, it's demanding, and intuition is quiet. It's steady, it's calm, it doesn't scream. It simply knows that learning the difference takes practice.
Here's one I've definitely done. Why do I think everyone is mad at me?
Because when home wasn't emotionally predictable, you learned to monitor people's moods. So now silence feels dangerous. A delayed text feels like rejection. A different tone of voice feels personal. But our brains often confuse uncertainty with evidence.
Why can't I forget? Why does my brain keep bringing up things from years ago?
Trauma memories aren't always stored like ordinary memories. The brain keeps revisiting unfinished experiences because it's still searching for safety. It's asking, can we finally make sense of this? Can we finally survive this?
Here's one people don't always talk about. Does having a bad thought make you a bad person?
Absolutely not. Everyone has intrusive thoughts. The difference is trauma survivors often judge themselves for having them. So thoughts are not choices. Thoughts are not character. Thoughts are simply mental events. What matters is how you respond to them.
Why letting go? Why can't I just let it go?
Because healing isn't forgetting, it's integrating. You don't let go because someone tells you to. You let go when your nervous system finally believes that it's safe enough to do so. So you can stop holding on.
If I know I'm safe, why don't I feel safe?
Because your thinking brain and your survival brain aren't always communicating. Your logical brain says, I'm safe, but your nervous system says, not yet. Healing's teaching these two parts to trust each other again.
Will my mind ever stop doing this?
Not overnight. Some thoughts may always visit, but they don't have to control you. The goal isn't to never have anxious thoughts. The goal is to recognize them sooner, believe them less, recover more quickly. This is healing.
How do I know when I'm actually healing?
Boy, the dog snores pretty loud. I hope you don't hear that. Healing isn't measured by never struggling. It's measured by what you do. When the struggle shows up, you know that you're healing when you pause before believing every thought. You respond with curiosity instead of shame. You stop assuming that every feeling is a fact, and you recover more quickly after difficult moments. So you choose compassion over self-criticism, and you begin trusting yourself again. You don't wake up one day completely healed. You notice that the war inside your mind is getting quieter. This isn't because your life becomes perfect. It's because you no longer believe that every thought that passes through your mind.
You mentioned that trauma changes what our brains pay attention to. What exactly do you mean by that?
Well, one of the biggest changes that trauma creates is something called negative bias. So negative bias is our brain's tendency to notice, remember, and focus on negative experiences more than positive ones. So now everyone has some degree of negative bias because our brains are wired for survival. You can't get away from that. So let's look at how it began. So like thousands of years ago, remembering, dangerous berries or predators hiding in bushes kept our ancestors alive. But trauma turns this natural survival system up to full volume. So instead of simply noticing danger, our brains began expecting it, and we start scanning every situation for what could possibly go wrong instead of what might go right.
So that's why one negative comment can ruin my whole day, even if 10 people compliment me.
Exactly. So imagine that 10 people tell you that they loved your presentation, but one person says, I didn't like it. Which comment are you thinking about when you get home? For most trauma survivors, it's the criticism. Not because, it's being dramatic, but because the brains learned that negative information might be important for survival. So the compliment feels nice for a few seconds, but the criticism gets replayed for hours and sometimes even days.
That explains another question I've always wondered. Why do compliments make me uncomfortable?
Because compliments often don't match the story that trauma taught you about yourself. So if you spent years believing that you're not good enough, and then someone says, you're amazing, this creates a conflict inside your mind. Your brain starts looking for evidence that the compliment isn't true. So you might think something like, they're just being nice. If they really knew me, they wouldn't say this. They're only saying this because they feel sorry for me. That's negative bias filtering out positive information because it doesn't fit the beliefs that you've carried for years.
So negative bias isn't just about seeing the negativity. It's about believing the negative more easily than the positive.
Exactly. So trauma teaches us to trust criticism and question kindness. Healing is learning to question the criticism and accept the kindness.
Okay, so if negative bias changes what I pay attention to, where do cognitive distortion come in? I've heard that term before, but I honestly don't know what it means.
That's a great question.
Legit.
People hear the phrase cognitive distortion and they assume it means that you're crazy, but it doesn't. So a cognitive distortion is simply a habit of thinking that twists the way that we interpret reality. So notice how I said the word interpret.
Yep.
That's key. So a cognitive distortion doesn't change what actually happened. It changes the meaning our brain assigns to what happened. So think of it like wearing a pair of glasses. If the lenses are scratched, cracked, or tinted, a certain color, the world looks different. Not because it changed, but because the lens has changed. Trauma becomes this lens.
So cognitive distortions are kind of mental shortcuts.
Exactly. These are automatic conclusions that our brains make without us realizing it. So the important thing to understand is that these distortions were often learned during survival. They weren't created because you're weak or you're irrational. They developed because your brain was trying to make sense of difficult experiences.
Here's one I know I've done. Why do I think everyone is mad at me? God, I can speak, right?
Happens to me too. This is often an example of a cognitive distortion. It's called mind reading. Mind reading happens when we assume that we know what someone else is thinking without actual evidence. So someone walks past you without saying hello. Immediately, your brain says, they're upset with me. Maybe they were distracted. Maybe they didn't see you. Maybe they had a difficult morning. But trauma often fills in the blanks with the worst possible explanation or scenario because uncertainty feels dangerous. Catastrophizing. It's another one.
Okay, then why do I always expect the worst?
This is called catastrophizing. Your brain jumps straight to the worst case scenario. So let's say that your boss says, "Can we talk tomorrow?" So instead of thinking maybe it's just a meeting, your brain immediately goes to, "I'm getting fired." Trauma teaches us to prepare for disaster because at one time, disaster really did happen unexpectedly.
Here's another one. Why do I replay the conversations over and over?
Several distortions can be involved here. One of the biggest is called personalization. Personalization is believing that you're responsible for things that may have little or nothing to do with you. So you replay the conversation wondering, did I say something wrong? Did I offend them? Should I have answered differently? Your brain keeps searching because it believes finding the mistake will prevent future pain.
What about this one? If I feel everyone hates me, doesn't that mean it's true?
Emotional reasoning. It's one of the most common distortions that trauma survivors experience. Emotional reasoning says, I feel it, therefore it must be true. But feelings are important signals. They're not always accurate facts. So you can feel unsafe perfectly, in a perfectly safe room. You can feel rejected by someone who deeply loves you. You can feel like a failure while accomplishing something incredible. Our emotions deserve attention, but they should always be examined with curiosity.
So healing isn't about ignoring our feelings.
Not at all. It's about learning to ask, what is the feeling trying to tell me? So instead of automatically believing that every story our brain creates around it. So like your first thought isn't always the truth. One of the biggest myths about healing is that you'll stop having negative thoughts. But this isn't actually the goal. Healing isn't about controlling your first thought. It's about recognizing that your first thought doesn't have to become your final belief. Naturally, you can transition into automatic thoughts. You can transition from them, I should say. So cognitive distortions protect us until they don't. Cognitive distortions didn't appear because our brains were defective. They developed because they once helped us predict danger, avoid rejection, or prepare for disappointment. The problem is that they continue operating even after the danger has passed. So negative bias, versus cognitive distortions, I think the distinction is worth making because people often confuse these. So negative bias, your brain notices negative information first. Cognitive distortion, your brain interprets this information inaccurately. So here's an example. Your spouse walks in quietly. Negative bias notices, excuse me, something feels off. Mind reading. Here's a cognitive distortion. They're mad at me. Catastrophizing says they're going to leave me. Personalization might say, it must be something I did. That comparison, I hope, will help with concepts. Trauma changes our interpretation, so not just memory. Two people can experience the exact same event and assign completely different meanings to it, like you said. So someone forgets to text you back. So one person could think they're probably busy. A trauma survivor might think, I upset them. It's the same event, the same story, but two different interpretations. And this is the war inside your mind. So in the workbook, we talk about the amygdala, excuse me, and the prefrontal cortex. Have you ever known something logically but still couldn't feel it emotionally? It's because your thinking brain and your survival brain aren't always in agreement. So when we were talking about the glasses, like the scratched up glasses, trauma's like wearing a pair of glasses. So like if the lenses are messed up, it doesn't mean things around you are messed up. It's just that the lens has an issue. So I'm not enough, I'm too much, I don't matter, have to earn love, things that we explained earlier. So like cognitive distortions often grow out of these deeper beliefs. Neuroplasticity. I don't know if you've ever heard of that. We briefly discussed that, but your brain learns survival through repetition, right? It can learn healing through repetition, and that's why repetition is so important. So you can start changing your mindset. These thoughts are not your identity. Intrusive thoughts, they're not facts. Thoughts are not choices. They're not your character. They're not stuff like that. They're mental events. So when you said, does having a bad thought make you a bad person? No. Many people think that healing means that they'll never overthink. They'll never feel anxious. They'll never get triggered. But it often looks like noticing the distortion sooner. So you question it instead of believing it immediately, calming your nervous system more quickly. Then you choose a healthier response. You recover faster after difficult moments. So let's say that your friend doesn't have an answer for your text and you sit there. Your brain may simultaneously experience negative bias. Something is wrong. Mind reading. They're mad at me. Personalization. I must have done something. Catastrophizing. This friendship is over. But emotional reasoning brings you back to, I feel rejected, so I must be rejected. Your brain is not messed up. It just adapted. So one of the biggest mistakes that trauma survivors make is believing that there's something wrong with them because they overthink, expect rejection, or struggle to trust people. But the truth is, the brain adapted to the environment in which it lived. What once protected you may now be getting in your way, but that doesn't mean that you're completely messed up. Not every thought deserves your trust. We often believe that because a thought popped into our thoughts or suggestions, we have issues. But you need to start through repetition, you start to ask yourself, is this thought accurate or is it familiar? The nervous system then starts writing the first draft. When you're triggered, the nervous system often writes the first draft of the story, with the thinking brain has the opportunity to revisit it once we slow it down, if that makes any sense. So one of the things in the workbook, it discusses how different psychologists define cognitive distortions as different things. I can't remember off the top of my head, what is it? I don't know, maybe 10, 12 cognitive standard distortions. Other people constitute the other cognitive distortions as negative bias. Some people say they're all cognitive distortions. It kind of depends on whom you ask. But my point is this. Because this is so much information, I don't want to sit here for 2 hours with you and dump on you all of these things that you're not going to remember. And this is why I really, really hope that you'll go to the workbook and then read it on your time. I've listed all of the cognitive distortions, the negative bias, the terminology, the things with the brain, that kind of stuff. So we'll just sum this up with, healing doesn't erase triggers. I want you to remember that. A lot of people will quit because they think that they're failing. But remember that you can still get triggered and still heal. Triggers might be something that happens for a very long time. It may never actually go away, and you might have to coach yourself when you are triggered. Learn your triggers so that you can have this conversation and coach yourself. Maybe you recover in an hour instead of a week, and this is how you know that you're starting to heal. Maybe you recognize what's happening before it takes over, and you're noticing your trigger. This is growth. So we don't see the world as it is. We see it through our experiences. And this is what we were talking about with the broken lens and the negative bias. And that's exactly why two people can respond so differently to the same event. It all depends on their life experiences. So positive thinking is great, but that's not the goal that we're going for. Maybe at some point, what we're trying to do is we're advocating optimism at all costs. So we're not trying to replace every negative thought with a positive one. We're trying to replace distorted thoughts with accurate, balanced thoughts. So I've suffered from various cognitive distortions. One of the biggest ones I've listed in the workbook, it's called fallacy of fairness, or fairness of fallacy, depending on whom you ask. Basically what that is when something occurs in my life and I feel it's wrong, then, since my first survival instinct is to fight, that's my adaptation. So let's just say something happens. So let's look at, here's a scenario. There's two people. First person, let's say they live in a very fairly decent financial free existence. They're, they don't go to the grocery store and go, oh God, how much is this going to cost? Do I have enough money to cover it? Do I have to put something back? The other person is on a budget. They go to the grocery store. Oh, no big deal. I don't look at prices. I pay for my stuff and I leave. Never give it a second thought. My bills are paid on time. I don't worry about that. The other person, they have a hard time in their mind, going to sleep because the brain is like, oh, the electric bill, it's due on the 10th. Oh, the gas bill, it's due on the 12th. Is my check going to be big enough to pay for it all? Do you see where I'm going with that? So fallacy of fairness, like me, would be like, okay, well, let's just throw out there and pretend this isn't always the situation, and I'm not trying to stereotype, but let's just pretend that the guy that's got the money that doesn't freak out over the groceries or the bills is a real prick, okay? But he's financially well off. Now let's pretend the guy that freaks out over his bills and worries about his groceries is the nicest guy that you'll ever meet. Morals are great, nice person, yada, yada. But, what comes to mind is, well, that's wrong. So how come the asshole always seems to get ahead in life and the nice guy always finishes last? So that's not right. That's wrong. So the right and the wrong is what, maybe that's a stupid scenario, but right and wrong gets in the way for me. And so if something happened to me as a kid that was not okay, it's to fight over whatever scenario it is that it's wrong. Well, no, that should have never happened because it's wrong. And I get stuck in the whole right or wrong. But the bottom line is it's an argument that I have and I'll fight it, but it's pointless because we live in a world it's not perfect. True. So right or wrong doesn't matter. So the guy sitting next to you that did X, Y, and Z could give a shit, even though your mind is, well, morally, that's incorrect. So what I was told was that the reason that I fight with cognitive distortion of fallacy of fairness is because of having a high moral compass. So I'm sitting in therapy one day and this counselor brings this up to my, she tells me, interrupts me, whatever, and schools me on fallacy of fairness. And then she, explains it and what have you, and I'm listening to it. And then, so basically what I'm hearing you say is because I have a high moral compass, I have issues. I'm waiting for you to tell me I'm all fucked up, but I'm not. This is a cognitive distortion. This is just one example. So yes, distortion is the key word. It distorts your thought process. So you get stuck in whatever distortion it might be. I'm just using this as an example. So I'm going to use something really heavy and really, really serious so that you get me. The other one was just kind of a half-ass explanation. Why do children get abused? I don't want to step on anybody's toes, but why does a child pass away? What's the first thing that, goes through your head? Now, I might offend somebody here that's a heavy Christian, and I'm Christian too, but, what goes through your head? Somebody that's been in a trauma experience could go back and go, if there's a God, then why would God take away this child? Why did God allow this to happen? Why, when I was hungry and I prayed to God, I wasn't fed? Why, when I was molested and somebody came into my room and violated me and I asked God to make it stop, why did it continue? And in the back of your head, that can mess up your relationship with your, whatever religion you have, because the right and the wrong. Well, this should have never happened because it's wrong. Do you see what I'm saying? Does that make sense?
Yep.
Does it? Or am I babbling here?
No, 100% makes sense.
Okay, so that's what you get stuck on with this particular thing, is you get stuck on, well, this is bullshit, it shouldn't have happened, rather than, okay, it did occur, whatever situation may happen again, we're not going to stop crime, and world is never going to be the way that we completely, in a perfect world, these things wouldn't occur, but we don't live in a perfect world. So getting stuck on right or wrong It just kind of gets in the way of moving through the situation of what needs to happen, grieving, accepting, whatever it may be, wherever you're at in your journey, if that makes any sense. So I know I got on my soapbox here a little bit, but your inner critic, it has a history. Remember the critical voice that, you have, it didn't appear overnight. For a lot of people, it echoes messages that they heard growing up. So recognizing where it came from doesn't excuse the pain, but it helps to explain why it's there. And I think when you have a little bit of an explanation, you can kind of move forward and your brain isn't going, why do I do that? Why do I do that? You know what I mean? Once you're able to learn, oh, hey, this is why. So the next time that you catch yourself thinking, I'm a failure, or they're mad at me, don't argue with the thought immediately. Just pause and ask yourself, like, which cognitive distortion might this be? This gives you enough space to think about it, and your thinking brain can come back online and you can start thinking rationally again. So trauma may have, taught your mind to expect danger, rejection, and disappointment. But healing doesn't erase the past. It teaches your mind that the pain doesn't have to write every chapter of your future. The loudest voice in your mind isn't always the wisest one. Remember that. Healing begins when you learn to listen for the voice of truth instead of the voice of fear. So, kind of a metaphor here. The war inside your mind, isn't between good thoughts and bad thoughts. It's between the beliefs that trauma taught you and the truth that you're learning today.
If today's episode helped you better understand why your mind works the way it does, don't stop here. Download the companion workbook for the war inside your mind. It expands everything we just discussed today with detailed explanations, reflections, questions, exercises, and practice tools to help identify your cognitive distortions, understand your core beliefs, and begin changing the way you think.
And if someone came to your mind today while you were listening today, maybe a friend, a family member, a coworker, please share this episode with them. Sometimes the greatest gift that we can give someone is helping them to realize that they're not completely dysfunctional. They're not broken. They're not messed up. They're human. Healing's possible. So thank you for spending this time with us. Really appreciate it. Hope that you have a great week. Hope that you download the workbook. Hope that's helpful for you. And we hope that this episode gives a little bit of, what's the word I'm looking for? Explanation for the war within, your mind, the war that's happening inside your mind. This can be changed, but
Takes time.
Yeah. It's not something that's going to happen in a day. So please don't beat on yourself for that. Remember, if you were programmed for, a long time, you have to deprogram your brain, and your neural pathways can do that through repetition, like we said. Anything you want to add?
No.
All right. Well, you guys have a great week. Thank you for tuning in. Please subscribe and follow us for the next episode, the next podcast, the next workbook, whatever it may be, so that you can keep up on your healing and, the work that we're putting into the series. Thank you very much. You're listening to Unapologetically Reborn. This is where survival ends and choices begin.